and they work in the town of Gibson, BC. So that's the first community in North America that experimented with integrating natural assets into asset management and financial planning. So this is really kind of innovative work that they've been doing. And we are very lucky to have Michelle Molnar with us today. So she's the technical director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and she's also works at the David Suzuki Foundation as an environmental economist and policy analyst. So she's quite an expert in this domain, and we're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So without further ado, Michelle, I'll hand it over to you and take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Reza, and to Brace for the opportunity to chat with you today. So just to give you a brief overview of the Municipal Natural Assets for those who haven't heard of us, we're a nonprofit organization that provides scientific, economic, and municipal expertise to support and help guide local governments in identifying, valuing, and accounting for natural assets in their asset management programs and financial planning. At the end of the day, the goal is to assist these communities with developing leading edge, sustainable, and climate resilient infrastructure. So in terms of an agenda, I'm going to be speaking largely to the report that's there on the right-hand side of the screen. I've provided a link, so most of what I tell you today can be found right there. In terms of an agenda, however, I'm going to start with a bit of background on how the town of Gibsons really got into natural asset management, what really spurred them to start thinking this way. I'll touch a bit upon the methodology we developed with them to start to incorporate natural assets into a standard asset management program. And then I'm going to spend really the bulk of my time discussing the lessons learned since the town started down that path. So that's been about 6 years or so. Okay, so it all started with an aquifer mapping study. Back in 2013, due to some concerns about potential development happening in the town, an aquifer mapping study was completed. So this was a $500,000 study that sought to define the physical characteristics of the town's underlying aquifer. The goal was to gain an understanding of the water supply benefits provided by that aquifer. So the conclusions reached by the study was that the aquifer does indeed provide sufficient water storage to supply the projected population of Gibsons for the foreseeable future. And it's doing that at a fraction of the cost of an engineered water supply system. So based on these results, Gibsons increased their investment in the maintenance of that aquifer and started to become really interested in quantifying the value of more of their natural assets. And they got the town really quite involved in this idea. So they engaged school children in the process, and in the process educated them on the structure and functioning of aquifers. And they found that this rippled through the full community. To the degree that they received a standing ovation when the results of the study were presented to the community. So they got people quite interested and engaged in the thinking around natural assets. Now, about the same time that that study was being completed, they were doing their asset management plan. So consistent with the new PSAB 31 standards and requirements, the town determined the state and value of its tangible capital assets. But upon reviewing the list of their assets, some were uneasy about the lack of recognition for natural assets. Now, of course, the aquifer and its incredible value was fresh in their minds, but also was their foreshore, which protects the business area from storm surges and king tides, as well as the forest that conveys and absorbs their stormwater. So town officials ultimately understood that if any of these natural assets were to fail, the community would be required to develop an engineered alternative without having allocated any funds to do so. So this created effectively an undocumented risk. In short, they realized that they couldn't afford not to recognize their natural assets. Shortly after this realization, we started on the White Tower Park study. And we designed that study to really test a framework for incorporating natural assets into an asset management process. At that time, the town was facing a decision related to development upstream of the park that would require a large bypass pipe to take the stormwater from the development to the ocean. So for this study, we looked specifically at a series of ponds located within the park that provide stormwater retention and flood peak reduction during large storm events. So these ponds receive drainage from the Upper Charming Creek watershed. We did a site visit and determined that the location of the ponds was really quite ideal for attenuating peak flows from upstream, and that the depth of the main pond could easily be increased by 1 to 2 meters to increase the level of service provided. So we completed modeling and economic analysis and determined that the stormwater services provided by those ponds in White Tower Park have a value of between 3.5 to 4 million if they had to be replaced by an engineered asset. So that's the cost of that bypass pipe. That cost could be avoided through regular maintenance of the park. And the regular maintenance fees just to maintain those ponds are orders of magnitude less than the bypass pipe. We're talking about maybe tens of $1,000s a year at the top end. So fast forward 6 years, and we've started to build the case that natural asset management doesn't only apply to small West Coast communities who live in a seaside forest. MNAI is now a not-for-profit organization. We've assisted local governments with recognizing natural assets through each stage of the asset management process. We've worked with about 15 communities across British Columbia, Ontario, and New Brunswick. So we hope we're starting to build some proof of concept with our work. Now, just before getting to the lessons learned by Gibsons, I should clarify how we refer and define the term natural asset. So generally speaking, the terms natural asset or natural infrastructure and green infrastructure are used interchangeably, but they're not really precisely the same. So natural assets refers to the stock of natural resources in ecosystems that yield a flow of benefits to people. Green infrastructure is a broader term and also includes designed and engineered elements that have been created to mimic natural functions. So the work that we do tends to occur more towards the left side of the diagram there, but in practice we're really talking about more of a continuum when we're thinking about natural assets, because of course many have been enhanced by people over the years, and also in the pursuit of managing them, we can start exploring and getting into engineered assistance. So with that clarified, let me turn to the lessons that Gibsons has learned since they started this journey. So I'll talk about 10 key lessons that other local governments should consider as they adopt or consider adopting municipal natural asset management. So the order that I'm going to present these in is generally aligned with the steps of natural asset management and is shown in the figure. Please don't feel like you need to read through that figure as I'll walk through each step individually. Okay. So lesson 1 is it's not necessary to wait for a natural asset financial reporting requirement before incorporating natural assets into asset management. many see the first obstacle to recognizing natural assets as related to the PSAB reporting requirements. Those requirements don't recognize natural assets as a form or a class of tangible capital assets. In the interim, because we are hoping they will change those standards, and as a first step to recognition, the town added a statement within their significant accounting principles to acknowledge the importance of natural assets and really the need to manage them in conjunction with engineered assets. So I took that statement and provided it right on the right-hand side of the slide here. It's fairly straightforward and can be incorporated into any town's accounting principles. Furthermore, an important distinction can be drawn between financial reporting and financial planning. So the rest of the lessons that I'm really going to be talking about throughout this webinar apply almost exclusively to financial planning and are not substantially affected by the PSAB guidance. There are, in fact, opportunities throughout the year to incorporate natural assets into asset management and financial planning. Okay, lesson number 2 is natural registers add value, but they are not an essential first step. So really the second lesson is to start from where you are. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and go down rabbit holes trying to fully replicate the asset management process for natural systems. And I think asset registers are a really good example of that. And in fact, it's one area that Gibsons decided not to tackle right away. Gibsons does in fact have 2 registers, one that's quite high level for financial reporting, and the other that's more detailed for their asset management purposes. But in fact, to date, the town's natural assets are not included in either. And this has not inhibited improvement management of those natural assets. Now, they are undergoing efforts to determine how best to integrate assets into those registers in future years. Key challenges for them right now includes how do you recognize natural assets that perform many functions? For example, White Tower Park provides many recreational services as well as stormwater management services. Also, how do you record assets that are used by the town but might be under the jurisdiction of others? So local governments, in the meantime, could consider adding some basic information on their natural assets, existence and location, maybe as well as whatever is known about its quality, its service levels, in whatever register you use. And we have been doing a bit of work with this on Vancouver Island. Lesson number 3 is gathering natural asset risk information supports more informed and integrated decision making. So there's no requirement to document community reliance on natural assets. Nevertheless, not surprising, the town believes it's important to understand, document, and communicate reliance on natural assets, whether or not you own that asset, as a matter of prudence and risk communication. Once local governments have a basic inventory of their natural assets and a sense of the services they provide, a simple risk assessment like the one in the figure here can help governments to prioritize efforts and focus on those assets that pose the highest risk, where risk is defined as the likelihood of the event multiplied by the impact of the event. So this is something that Gibsons has done to really direct their efforts in what natural assets, I guess the order of the natural assets that they're starting to incorporate into their asset management process. Lesson number 4 is that a municipal natural asset management approach can encourage more integrated approaches across government. So here's an example having to do with neighborhood development. Um, Prior to the council's decision to define nature as an asset, the town typically approached new developments in a very linear fashion that did not really maximize potential synergies between departments or really consider developments in a very integrated terms. So for example, in the past, the town would define the service levels for the development. Um, they were often higher than required. Um, they would go and propose engineered or maybe even biomimicry solutions to meet those service levels. And then they would allow developers to essentially scrape the land and put in place new engineered or biomimicry assets, all of which required upkeep and maintenance. So they found that these disconnected steps really resulted in a gap between what they asked developers to build and what they could afford to maintain over the long term. Today, as a result of its natural asset policy and life cycle considerations, the town considers developments holistically to see whether fewer new amenities can provide equivalent levels of service and to determine whether existing assets can be preserved, maintained, maybe even enhanced before proposing new assets and allowing developers to clear the land. So now they look at what's on the land, what can be saved. Um, and they find that this approach really can result in a smaller, lower cost asset inventory for the town to manage, with a greater proportion of the natural assets left intact. Um, they've also seen that it results in town departments working together as teams, as opposed to disconnected silos. All right, lesson 5 is think in terms of life cycle costing and investment returns. So this is really following from the previous lesson. As part of its more integrated decision making, the town, whenever relevant, now compares the life cycle of natural and engineered assets before making capital decisions. Um, so this includes, of course, startup costs and financial flexibility. Existing natural assets often have no upfront costs, whereas, of course, engineered assets do. So using them effectively can reduce costs. Additionally, implementation can be phased in over time. So costs would be incrementable and achievable as development progresses. In terms of operating and maintenance costs, an operating cost for a natural asset can be really viewed as an investment because the natural asset does not necessarily have an end of life. And with proper stewardship, it actually gets more valuable. And then in terms of end of life, well-maintained natural assets, think of forests or wetlands, will likely have appreciated in terms of both service to the municipality and benefits to the community from healthy ecosystems. So benefits like habitat, biodiversity, cultural values, recreational values, health values are all still present at the end of life, and there's no need to, of course, dispose of any of those. Lesson 6 is a park is not always just a park. Traditionally, Gibson's parks were managed solely for recreational benefits. So for example, the park department would maintain trails, benches, and other similar amenities to really promote a positive recreational experience. However, when they started looking at that park through a municipal natural asset management lens, they found that some of those parks are in fact not just parks. So White Tower Park, for example, is being operated and maintained not just for its recreational benefits by the Parks Department, but it's also managed in concert with other departments for its stormwater management services. So financial planning for White Tower Park actually reflects this combined management. Their annual operating budget includes parks-related maintenance and costs for stormwater management. For example, periodic dredging of the ponds. So the suggestion here is that other local governments can really benefit from taking a critical look at assets such as parks and determine whether they can be managed for a broader set of objectives and outcomes. Lesson number 7 is that including natural assets in financial planning can be straightforward, and it doesn't need to be that much different than dealing with any other asset. So Gibsons produces an overall 5-year financial plan, as well as more detailed plans divided by asset classes. And those detailed plans might cover anywhere from 20 to 100 years. They find, though, that completing this planning is no more challenging for natural assets than engineered assets. And I've provided a bit of an example here of their approach to some of their water infrastructure. So although the details of financial planning might differ across local governments, different governments might use different software or have slightly different reporting formats. At the end of the day, however, the basic elements are the same. And so in principle, all local governments should be able to integrate natural asset considerations into their financial plans. It's simply a matter of integrating the costs associated with the ongoing operations and maintenance of a natural asset into your financial plan. Okay, lesson 8 is that development cost charges can fund natural asset restoration and enhancement. So in British Columbia, the Local Government Act sets out how local governments can apply development cost charges. These are intended to pay for common services incurred as a direct result of a new development. So I'm sure there's something similar in New Brunswick. The idea is that they will offset costs to the local government by ensuring that cost is shared with the developers. So in British Columbia, development cost charges can be charged for things like roads, sewage, water, drainage, and parkland acquisition and improvement. Now, once the Gibsons Council defined nature as an asset, and as the town's understanding of natural assets grew, it became apparent that they were contributing to common storm services. So the town amended its development cost charge bylaw and is now collecting charges for improvements to natural assets. So this has really been important in finding that kind of ongoing maintenance funding stream for natural assets. Lesson number 9 is know and use the available funding sources for natural asset management, rehabilitation, and enhancement. So Gibson's received about $250,000 through the Federal Provincial Clean Water and Wastewater Fund to update their integrated stormwater management plan, which will have a focus on the role of natural assets that underpin the town's stormwater management system. But of course, other funding sources are on the horizon across Canada. The Investing in Canada plan announced by the federal provincial government in 2017 provides for integrated bilateral agreements. And these agreements include a national $9.2 billion green infrastructure stream, which allows for the use of natural infrastructure for adaptation, resilience, and disaster mitigation. And here's the key point. If appropriate definitions, direction, guidance, targets are put in place by provinces, then this will really result in a substantial boost for funding for natural assets. Okay, and the last lesson is that service can be more important than jurisdiction. So Charman Creek, the area that we were looking at in White Tower Park, runs through the municipal boundaries of the town and provides stormwater services. And although the town manages Charman Creek as a natural asset, it's actually under the jurisdiction of the province of BC. So practically speaking, that means that the town must seek permission to enter riparian areas and maintain and enhance that asset. Nonetheless, the town determined that it was still worth the effort of maintaining that natural asset due to risk and cost considerations primarily. And so although, of course, there's some short-term costs for them in doing so, over the long term, they really see it as a benefit. Okay, so this is available in the report, and I think it's a great figure. I'm not going to walk through it all, but I think when we started this work with Gibsons, we thought that, you know, we'd end it over a year to a year and a half, and we'd all kind of go on our way, and not too much would change in the town. But as they've started thinking about natural assets and how it can be applied, and taking some of those early lessons, they've really found that it's changed the way they work throughout the city in ways they wouldn't have guessed. And I wouldn't say that that's going to end anytime soon. In fact, they make it very clear at the beginning of the report that there's still a lot of learning to be done, and they will share their lessons as more and more uncover themselves. So the conclusion reached by the town is really that it pays to invest in nature. They've actually developed a goal to have infrastructure assets that are as natural as they can be, that are the most energy efficient, that are the most reliable, that cost the least to operate over the long term. And of course, they're now incorporating natural capital or natural assets into operations. So they find it's a great fit for their town. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, just so we have some time for discussion. I have provided here our website, which contains not just the Gibsons case study of how we went about our work in White Tower Park, but case studies for all the other communities we've worked with. More to be coming up this fall.
The conference is now in talk mode.
I've provided, just our Facebook page, and of course a couple of emails to reach out if you have any more questions, or if you're interested in discussing how this might apply to your community. And I'll leave it with that. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. That was really interesting. So we're gonna go into Q&A, but I just want to do a little logistical thing here and just see, there's a bunch of you in the webinar, but I wonder do we have other people on the phone? Is there anyone else on the phone that is listening in? And we're going to do that same thing on the French line. No. Okay. So it looks like everyone's here. So, yeah, we have time for questions. On a quelques minutes pour plusieurs minutes pour des questions. So you should have your microphone activated, I think, so you can try speaking. Anyone, you can just let me know if you have a question, but if you're speaking and we can't hear you, that's fine. We may be experiencing technical difficulties, but you can also just type it into the chat box and then I'll make sure that Michelle sees the question. So who has a question? I see Adam is typing something. So everyone's going to wait patiently for Adam to type. And so if other people have questions too, you can also type them, or as I said, you can just try speaking. Okay, so this is what Adam has to say. It's just how did you calculate the replacement cost in the White Tower Park example? Was it based only on the cost of the bypass pipe or maintenance too?
Okay, that's a great question. Generally, we use replacement cost as the value of the asset. So we looked at what it would cost to match the capacity of the ponds with engineered infrastructure. Now, in addition to, that's almost like a capital value of the ponds, we also look at maintenance costs, and in some cases, as well as monitoring for the assets, and that's more of a yearly operational expense. So we do both, but the value of the pond was based upon the replacement cost, which was the engineered alternative.
Thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Adam says thanks. Well, we do have still a good chunk of time for questions, but maybe
it was a lot of information, so certainly don't feel like you can't reach out after the fact.
Yeah, and everyone's got the email address there. It looks like we have a few more people typing in the chat. So John Russell says, do you depreciate the asset 6?
And it probably was just asset
question mark. Yeah, that's might be a typo. Do you depreciate the assets? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. We don't, because in financial reporting, you would generally do that. But because we can't formally recognize the assets according to PSAB standards, in some ways, we haven't had to tackle that question too much. Although that's not to say we haven't had some great discussions with some of the finance directors in different communities. So I can give you an idea of maybe the range of approaches that have been discussed. Generally speaking, there's a willingness to depreciate either at the longest useful life of any other assets. So they might have some assets that say are depreciated over 100 years, so they'll take that longest life and adapt that. Or there's actually some communities that do recognize that if they're properly maintained, natural assets actually appreciate. So how would you address that, right? Would you actually apply a small appreciation rate? We have been discussing some of these issues with the Public Sector Accounting Board. And although they recognize that the intention of having natural assets excluded from the definition of tangible capital assets wasn't intentional to exclude natural assets, and they do recognize that they have value and can provide infrastructure mimicking services. that there are a number of questions like that that I think are a little trickier to work out, and that they'd want to be able to offer some kind of standard guidance on.
Okay, thanks. So we have environment and local government. So we don't actually know who this is, but there were a few people registered from ELG. Maybe you guys could just let us know. Maybe you're having a party or something and listening to the webinar, but maybe just let us know who you are, either in the chat or by email. But their question is regarding the cost. The replacement cost only measures the direct cost. So I'm wondering how to measure the social or indirect costs.
Okay. I guess my question is, so we value just the infrastructure services of the natural asset. Of course, there's a huge range of co-benefits that that asset comes with that we don't want to get lost when we're doing this work with local governments. So generally, one of the steps that we do, which I guess is kind of unique to natural assets, is to look at that range of co-benefits that is also provided. So that could be, anything from recreation to cultural values to health values to, air purification, and to take a look at what that range is, if there's any trade-offs with the service of interest. And although we don't necessarily model those services and put a value on them, because some of them are just much trickier to value, they're a little squishier. We do try to recognize them so that the broad suite of services is understood, and any trade-offs are also understood. That said, MNAI is starting to expand the list of infrastructure services that we offer. So we've been really focused on stormwater management, and we're starting to broaden that range of services.
Okay, great. And we have another question from Daniel, who's asking, how do you value or capitalize the water supply source?
Oh, yeah, we've started doing some of this work, and actually some of it is occurring in New Brunswick, and some of it is occurring in BC. So generally, we ask a town when we're looking at water supply. Of course, we do modeling to understand the capacity of the natural system to supply, to be a water supply source, and what would happen. And then the next question is what would happen if you didn't have this natural asset, and that's going to vary from region to region. In some smaller towns, they would truck in water. So what does that cost? In some larger regions, like some of the work we're doing in a watershed in British Columbia, it's a much larger community. So would they have to, look for the next, to the next town or the next region to see if they could connect to that water supply source, and then what would the cost of that be? So generally speaking, we work with looking at the engineered alternative, but it's really the engineered alternative is going to be unique to the town and its circumstances.
Okay. Oh, here's Adam. Great. So Adam's got another one, a broader question. Do you have any thoughts about what ecosystem services natural assets communities are most interested in having valued? He's asking what types of natural assets the communities are most interested in. He says, in our work, we find a lot of communities are interested in everything water related, flooding or water quality. And if your experience is the same or different.
Yeah, I would have to say that water, particularly due to climate change projections and what communities are starting to see, is of high interest to communities. So that could be inland flooding or coastal flooding, right? So we're working on a coastal model now too, which is, of course, coastal processes are quite different than some of the inland processes. So that's I would say of the highest interest. Closely following that are things like the urban heat island effect. So we know that very urban areas generally experience amplified temperatures than more rural or green areas. So what is the effect of forests and vegetation on cooling cities? And then some regions are also quite interested in air quality. Of course, this is more of we see this often more in urban centers or areas just, I guess, downwind of urban centers. So looking at the ability of green spaces to purify our air.
Okay, another one from John. Biodiversity could be a benefit, but there is avoided cost by the municipality. How would you value that?
Yeah, we generally don't value biodiversity. Of course, it's a benefit, but it's generally not a municipal mandate. So what we are doing, because we've had, it's interesting, when we started this work, I thought that municipalities would be really focused on those services that were clearly under their mandate and wouldn't be as focused on those services that fell without. So something like biodiversity or something like health might not be of interest. But I was wrong. Of course, many communities recognize that it's their natural areas that attract people to live in those places, and biodiversity is one of those co-benefits of having intact ecosystems. What we have been starting to consider and to do a bit of work on, and I'd be really interested in hearing feedback, is understanding how our approach benefits biodiversity or supports biodiversity, but not necessarily putting a value on it. So we could say, here's your natural systems, here's how it's supporting biodiversity, and after any of the modeling that we do and any work to enhance the natural areas, here's how and if it could further support biodiversity. But at this time, we haven't actually attempted to put a value on the biodiversity.
Okay, thank you. I haven't seen anyone else typing, so we'll do one last check for any other questions. John says thanks.
Yeah, and John, if you have thoughts, I'd be really interested in hearing them.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And thanks particularly to Michelle. This is really, really interesting, and I think has given us lots of food for thought. And thank you to all the participants who were on. I think, yeah, great webinar. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.